How to Web Live, episode number 5. I'm Camil Moldoveanu, founder of Reflex, a hardware medtech startup which offers virtual physical therapy. I'll be your host for today's episode. Our guest today is Eric Friedman, the CTO and co-founder of Fitbit. 12 years ago, Eric and his co-founder have started Fitbit in their free time and with borrowed money. They've overcome a market where many have failed, launched popular products, went public, and built the most successful consumer hardware startup of the last decade. Now he's closing the circle with a 2.1 billion acquisition by Google. Thanks to Bitdefender for powering this series and empowering our internet experience safety. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And good morning. I think it's pretty early.
I've got my coffee right next to me, so I'm ready to go. Good evening to you.
That's great. Let's just jump straight into. I'm really excited to have you here. We are looking at Fitbit since we founded our company, and yeah, I'm excited both for us and for the community to get some lessons and to see which are the successful strategies and the pitfalls of building such a great startup. So. Sure, I have some questions. We'll also get some questions from the audience. I'll just start with my first question, which goes into the early days. Can you tell us more about that period and how you've met your co-founder and what was the motivation to start Fitbit and the idea that sparked all this?
Sure. So my co-founder, James Park, who's the CEO of Fitbit, we've actually worked together for, over 20 years now. My entire adult working life and all but 1 year of his working life. And for people considering startups, I personally highly recommend having a co-founder. It's just that there's a lot of stresses in running companies, and there's no one who knows exactly what you're going through if you don't have a co-founder. And so someone just you can wrestle with topics with and things like that. It's truly great. So I met James in, I guess, 1999, early 2000. He was doing a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was the first employee there, founding engineer. That grew to 40 people, and what was what they call, I think, a learning lesson, which means, euphemistically, we went bankrupt. So we grew up, we shrank, had, in some ways, what actually most startups go through, like the empty chairs and empty tables moment of like, hey, we had to let everyone go. And then the eventual decision to shut it down and knowing when to return money to investors and when to cut our losses. In some ways, knowing when to quit is almost one of the hardest things of doing a startup. There's always this balance between drinking your own Kool-Aid and going full in. It was also interesting, learned a little bit about arbitrage from that. So I learned 2 lessons from that. One was arbitrage. So arbitrage, the idea of you sell things, you buy things at one price and sell things at the other. When we went bankrupt, we sold these giant CRT monitors. So I'm dating myself here. They cost us $4,000. We sold them for $1,000. Computers, pennies on the dollars. Everything, foosball, yes, you have a foosball table. Everything pennies on the dollar. There was no IKEA where we lived. And so we had shipped desks from the state of New York up to the state of Massachusetts, where we all lived. No one knew what an IKEA desk should go for. They're $99 in the US. At auction, when everything got sold off, they got sold for $200 or $150 each because everyone said those are nice desks. So that was the only thing that made money in that entire company's history was the IKEA desk that we resold. I think the other really valuable lesson is you have one pot of money. Investors have generally many pots of money. They would like to figure out which ones are successful. They want you to spend fast and figure out which ones they should keep investing their time and money into and which ones are not. Whereas as a founder, you generally have one baby, one thing you're investing all your effort into, and being like that right balance of frugality versus willingness to spend is an art form. So in some ways, the best thing from that startup was got to start working with James. We then went and co-founded another company together. It was a photo sharing company. First company was kind of amorphous B2B stuff. And we knew what we were doing. We're both engineers by training. It was really fun technical problems. but when we explained it to our friends, their face went blank, and maybe that should have been assigned to us. And so the second one, kind of photo sharing, grandma gets excited, everyone got excited. I think it really got us really interested in consumer stuff, things that like, goes direct B2B. Because you get immediate reaction from people, and you get immediate enthusiasm. And I think we both thrived on that. And just the fact that our friends and family were passionate users of the product was really exciting. That one, was also our first kind of social thing. So like understanding scale of consumer social is also a lot of fun from a technical perspective, but also just, again, really rewarding. We sold that to CNET, now owned by CBS, in 2005. And, that was definitely a skin of our teeth type sale, but it was a positive outcome, a good, great return on investment for our investors. And then we, spent a couple years at CNET, and then realized, we had spent a lot of time, sitting at our computers. At that point, we thought we were really old. We were both in our late 20s, and we were like, we're getting old for this game, which now in my 40s, I think is kind of laughable. And, James waited in line for Nintendo Wii when it first came out. And we were just shocked that how it transformed gaming. And I don't know if people on this call remember, video games used to be extraordinarily male, and it still skews male, but also used to be something where you'd sit on the couch, you'd be hunched over, you'd be playing on your controller and things like that. And Nintendo Wii got people up and moving. My grandfather was 94 in his, elder care home. They were doing Wii bowling night. There's no way that my grandfather was also playing Doom on an Xbox at the same time. And so it just seeing how that changed was really interesting. And we were really enamored by the fact that they had these controllers that were $30. They were clearly selling at a profit. And we were kind of already thinking about how do we get ourselves more fit and more active. And, I had the idea of like, what we fuse this sensor technology with kind of the online social networks we knew how to build and create something interesting that took health and fitness with you. And, I think in some ways the most interesting thing about Fitbit, at least from my perspective, first two companies, we pivoted all over the place, constant change of business direction. The end company was a web-based photo, the previous company was a web-based photo company in the end. We started off as a distributed shared data plan for cable modems. So lots of pivoting. Fitbit, I remember we sat in a burger joint, again, not a great thing, not a great look for Fitbit. They were eating French fries while working on our business plan. But we had a list of all the features we need to ship with. And what's incredible was about 10 years later, we finally finished that list. And the amount of variation from that list over the previous 10 years was very little. And the fact that we didn't pivot, it's been very unique for me and from other startups I've talked to. But it's been a great, you mentioned 12 years. We're going on almost 14 years this coming March, so about 13 and a half years now. It's been a crazy ride.
It was an overnight success. Lots of people are saying that it's overnight success, and looking at all these years, it's really a crazy ride. And I'm looking to find out more about how was the experience when you started producing the Fitbits. What were the first challenges, and which was the first breakthrough? And also, can you tell us a little bit about the first investment rounds?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. One of my colleagues, Don Baker, had a comment once of like, you're always a star of your own story. And I think it's very easy to mythologize successful startups and the early days of startups. And definitely I look back on them fondly. But in some ways you asked, what was it like? I think the best example I can give you is kind of that whole roller coaster phase of, especially the added hardware component. Like, James and I had done software, like, how hard can hardware possibly be? You just put a bunch of chips, like, we're both software guys, so, it's always hardware's fault. I see the motherboards behind you, how hard can that be? You just put a bunch of things on the board and, you ship it. It's software, it's the hard thing. Like, that takes millions of lines of code. Hardware is called hardware for a reason. It's hard. And so, I think it's hard, but it was a great, it was a great experience just kind of spending time at all the factories. We started manufacturing in Singapore and Indonesia. I remember I used to go over there. We'd go over there for a week, and I was dating this woman at the time. This woman now being my wife, so clearly she put up with it. But I'd say I'm going there for a week to kind of work on something. And every Thursday, we were really cheap because we didn't have that much money. And I'd write back of like, hey, I need to stay here an extra week. I'll come home next week. And so I moved my ticket out. And 2 months later, I'd return, which really shot our kind of our plans. But again, she put up with it. So maybe that's a good lesson. If you're going to find a partner at that point, find someone who's going to put up with your startup. But go over there, try and debug the lines. Had some truly terrifying moments. We had $2 million which we'd raised. We'd spent it all, and we get the first final thing off the line, kind of closed up, and we were our big thing was we were a wireless health and activity tracker. That was our novel thing. We were taking something you could buy sort of in your McDonald's, like you could buy a non-connected or get a non-connected pedometer, which is sort of an activity tracker, for free in your McDonald's Happy Meal. And we were trying to sell you one for $100, which was, it took a certain amount of, salesmanship. And, but the fact is, like, when we first built it, we got, about 3 or 4 centimeters worth of range. And we were supposed to get about, 10 meters worth of range. And so we had oh my God, we're about to lose before we even take off. And, that was, one of, I think, 3 or 4 truly terrifying, or there's emotional highs and there's emotional lows. And that was definitely an emotional low in a startup. And not only because we thought our work was going away, but we also thought all those people who invested in us and believed in us, we were going to let them down. And luckily, we were when we took it apart, it worked. When we put it together, it failed. And we figured out that the flex cable that kind of went over that connected the display to the board was interfering with the radio. And so James took a small bit of toilet paper, rolled that up, stuck it onto the flex cable, and magically it worked. And you'll be happy to know, for anyone who got an early Fitbit, it did not in fact contain toilet paper in it. We went to our CM, and finding a good partner is really important. And they're like, oh, we can replace toilet paper with a little piece of sticky foam tape. Does that still work? And it did. And they got to work and were massively cutting little 3 millimeter squares of foam, which took it from a complete failure to Fitbit as it is today. So that's been quite the ride. I'm gonna stop. I haven't gotten to fundraising. I'm happy to talk about that next, or we can.
I'm curious, what were the first milestones that you agree with the investors, and how that turned out? And also, we have a first question from the public. What were some of the most difficult moments early on? How did you overcome them? But this was already answered. So let's get back to the fundraising. I'm curious. So you've raised 2 million. That's the first official round, because as far as I know, you also got some money from family and friends when you started. But with the official round, you set up some milestones, and I'm curious to see, did you achieve the milestones? What was the story?
So I think there's several things. I think there's some people who are just amazing at raising money. And there's some people who build great product. And ideally, there are people who raise money and build great product. I like to think James and I are really good at building great product. We went public on basically $60 million raised. I'd love to tell everyone here that was due to our brilliance, our thriftiness. We knew how to thread that needle. That was all the money we could raise. And it turned out to be really good for the investors and really good for us, because we all owned more of this company, and we did it on less money. But that was not necessarily the intention from the beginning. So we did initial kind of seed round of about $400,000, friends and family. We were on an event similar to this when we announced our product, which was TechCrunch 50 at the time. And James and I were both on stage. We were kind of having trouble closing money at that time. We got a really enthusiastic response from the audience, and that really facilitated closing that first round of $2 million. And our investors at the time were led by True Ventures, and I think that in some ways, the thing that they did that was provide the most value in the early days is, stand back, say, look, we're investing in the people as much as the idea. We trust you. And in some ways, knowing that they had our back, like if we had problems, we'd go to them and ask questions. They were not breathing down our neck. They were very supportive. They had opinions, but they just wanted to let us run. And I think that early flexibility really helped us a lot. But we pitched probably 50 or 60 firms, kind of everything from angels to super angels to early stage capital to get the initial round with a couple of seed company firms plus True.
Okay. We also have lots of other questions, but I'm gonna go through some of the ones that I have prepared. But please, if the audience can add more questions, we're gonna get them in the second part of the episode.
One thing, by the way, on the fundraising, just because I think there's a lot of early stage companies on here, it is tough. Like again, there's some people who are just brilliant at fundraising. We had somebody fall asleep during a pitch. We had somebody who, through no fault of our own, it didn't show up on their calendar, and they were basically annoyed, and they felt we were kind of stealing a pitch spot that we didn't deserve. But because we were there, they let us pitch anyway, and they kind of sat there like arms crossed, really angry. All it takes is one or two successful pitches, and if you have a whole bunch of bad pitches, don't give up. That's just reflect, figure out what's you, what's them, adjust, and move forward. So.
I think that's great advice. I also was thinking that your mission was really, really big and innovative. Basically, you are changing a little bit of how people are doing their fitness. Now everybody talks about their 10,000 steps. And also you are competing for a place on their wrist where they had these nice and fancy design watches. So yeah, you are changing a lot, and I think 2 million, it wasn't that much. And you also already talked about the frugal moments. And I'm looking at this long timeline, and I'm thinking about how do you stay motivated and focused as a founder? Because I'm sure there were multiple times that were close to failure, possibly failure. And I'm always thinking about, in all this journey, how can you still stay focused and have your mission in mind, and don't look at the bad days necessarily.
Yeah, I'd say there's a fine line between mission and egotism. I think one does need a certain ego as a founder. You don't necessarily need to project it outside, but at least internally. I actually, like, the failures were really emotionally, and we had multiple, were really had a lot of emotional turmoil. I don't think they ever made us want to, like, in some ways they motivate us more because the need to pull up and survive. In some ways, our board used to comment in the early days that we blow away all of our financials. We would, like, in a good way. We would have great new products coming out. They were all really excited. And at board meetings, James and I would focus on, here are all the problems we have. Here's all the things we're working on, because we thought that was our job to kind of give them that. We didn't realize our job was also to sell the board. But we basically, like, I think the thing that motivates both of us is that next hill to climb. And in some ways, like, the nice thing about having problems is, boy, you've got a big hill to climb, and that's the fun part. And once you get to the top of the hill, it's kind of like, who cares? I want to focus on that next hill. And I think the difference to me is between being a founder and as you start growing your employee base is we did not necessarily do a great job in the early days. And I defer to our employees now as to whether we do a good job now. We never did a great job in the early days of celebrating our achievements. Because again, what motivated us was that next hill to climb. And I think especially as you start growing your org, and also all the people who are joining you on the journey, whether it be investors, whether it be fans and families, spouses, all those people, sometimes they need that support of that celebration more than you do. And so making sure you celebrate success not just for yourself, but also for everyone else is really important. But then I think to keep yourself motivated, you need to really enjoy that next hill. because otherwise it becomes a slog. If you want to get rich, go become an iBanker. Don't become a startup founder. Do a startup because it's fun and that passion just infuses you. You can't not do it. And then it'd be great if you make money, but you have to enjoy the journey because most startups fail. And having been through that, I can look back and I really enjoyed that journey, even when I thought, oh, was that a wasted 2 years? I could look back and say, no, I learned something. I'm real qualified for my next job.
Yeah, that's great advice. Definitely, I think very competitive founders need to learn how to enjoy the celebration and that specific moments, because we usually just go through the target and look for the next. I was thinking if you had any people that inspired you when you started Fitbit, and if you had any role models to follow.
I think there's several buckets. I think first and foremost, there is all the founders that came before us. Whether it be, someone like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs who created inspirational products and had very different personality types. I remember we watched what is it called? There was a great Bill Kringley miniseries on like kind of the rise of Silicon Valley, is talking about original Cisco founding and all these things. Those were really inspirational for us. But it's also like, I've always been amazed by how many startup founders will take the time to answer a call, answer anonymous email, and sit down and talk to you about what their experience is like. And we learned from a lot of people about all the different things, the mistakes they had made, and we then went and made, I'd say, 90% of the mistakes that we learned about, we then went and made ourselves. But the fact we knew that we could go, oh wait, we just made that mistake we'd heard about, made us better able to react and recover and be more resilient versus being knocked off our feet. Or just little things like how do you set up a sales commerce system, like taxes, like all kinds of little things. Those little hints then add up. I think, for me personally, my father, who was both a science professor and a bit of an entrepreneur, was definitely a bit of an inspiration for me. Of course, he also told me that this Fitbit thing is really silly. Don't you want to get a real job? He did invest, and he did get good return on investment. He's now very proud of that return on investment. But he was not. I think he felt it was safer to invest in Fitbit or cheaper to invest in Fitbit than sending to business school. So that was his belief in Fitbit. So. But I would say that was seeing him constantly work and enjoying work. I think fundamentally you were asked how do you keep yourself motivated? Work should be fun, and I think if you're doing a startup and you're having fun, that's going to maximize your chance. That's not the only thing you need for success, but that's going to maximize your chance.
Yeah, that's great advice. I was also thinking about when you're looking at other companies, you mentioned some of them, and for inspiration, you're focusing more on mistakes that you should avoid or achievements.
I think you look at both. When we were kind of in early industrial design stage, that at that point, the iPhone was just launching, and looking at kind of how they do rounded edges and like little things like that, of thinking like, okay, people pay more for design, and it's worth putting that extra effort in, even if you would save a few pennies, which you then pass on to your users. They will get more love and passion for the device from kind of the design is important. I think we talked to a lot of users. We sat down. So our original device was actually clip based, not wrist based, because our target demographic tend to be more female. Dislodging the bracelets and other things on the wrist was going to be very hard. Women didn't have pants. Well, actually, a lot of women actually wore it in their bra. And so we then went and bought 50 bras to make sure that different types of, I learned more about the structural architecture of a bra from doing Fitbit than I ever did from dating. And so, because kind of little things about how do you make the clip strength, and like, how do you make it comfortable? Like, we put soft touch paint on it because this was going against someone's skin. How do you make it nice and comfortable? And so I think really looking at kind of what are things doing across all kinds of different industries. Again, for us, we were looking as much clothing as hardware. What was really important and really, really valuable. I do think looking at mistakes is also important, especially for startups. I think, and then trying to reflect on what was luck and what was right place, right time, and what was a unique insight, and trying to distill those different buckets was also really important. Because generally successes fall into like one of those three and often multiple, and then try and tease it apart.
That's great. We have some questions from the audience. I will only be able to take one now, and then we have a short ad break, and afterwards we have another two or three. The one that we will do address right now is from Marius, and he's asking about early validation of your idea, and that the friends will always be excited. And maybe you can tell us more about what was the first traction that you actually got with Fitbit.
First of all, you said your friends will always be excited. I would say, again, maybe it's a cultural thing, or maybe it's a type. Maybe I just have bad friends. We tend to get a lot of cynical friends. So I would say if you're using your friends to validate your idea, get a bunch of cynics together. I even had family who were cynics. So I think that is important. In terms of other validations, I think for us, the big validation came from kind of our product launch event. Our friends were generally excited. We did some focus groups. We had a friend who owned a chain of women's fitness gyms. That gave us some validation. I think when we did this TechCrunch, we launched an online store. We didn't have a product that shipped yet, so we were taking pre-orders. This was back before people commonly took pre-orders. So you created your own website. You had to ask for a credit card. We didn't charge the credit card, but we got up on stage. I said, I don't think more than 10 people are going to be dumb enough to give their credit card to a company they've never heard of for a product they've never seen. And James is like, Eric, you're such a pessimist. I bet 50 people will give us their information. And we got up on stage, did the pitch. By the end of the day, we had 1,000 pre-orders. And I think that was the real validation. We also, when we got those 1,000 pre-orders, we said we'll be shipping by Christmas. We did that demo in September. We sincerely expected we were shipping that Christmas. We did ship by Christmas. It was just a year late, which is not uncommon for startups. But I think that validation was really valuable to us, and also valuable to our investors. Like, that's what helped get them more comfortable. And then when we ran out of money and needed a small bridge, that, like, seeing those pre-orders and that ongoing press helped them get more comfortable with their continued investment.
Okay. We will have to take a short ad break right now. We will be back in less than 1 minute. Welcome back. I will start with some of the questions that we got from the community. And let's address the question from Irina. She's asking if you had a strategy for fake it until you make it, and how long and how did it work if you had such a strategy?
I'm not sure it was a specific strategy. I think you always have to project a level of confidence, both kind of externally to to investors and to potential customers. Internally, if you have employees or contractors or people who are taking risks, even people who are service providers, they're taking a risk that you're going to actually be around to pay your bill. So you need to project that level of confidence. And honestly, you need to project it internally. Like if you stop believing in yourself and the idea, um, then as you commented earlier, you can't get motivated to get up in the morning to keep working and plugging away at it. I think in some ways the hardest thing was actually from the first, like when you keep going and things are successful, then it becomes really easy because you keep building on that next success, and you go, yeah, actually my bank account's on fumes. We're getting orders in, so we can keep going. So that becomes really easy. I think the harder thing is when your things are on decline. So in some ways, for us, the biggest you know fake it came not from success. It was we had a recall, and we had raised about $60 million at that point, and we had a product that went out that was not up to our quality standards, and some people people were wearing on their wrists and getting some skin reactions, and we decided that it was better for the brand to recall it and risk the company than not recall it, leave it out there, and create a festering problem. And that cost about $120 million, and we'd only raised $60 million at that point. So that was truly the terrifying event, especially when we didn't know what the problem was. I think that was in some ways, the biggest fake it before you make it thing, because yes, we made it, but we had to project that air of confidence, like we don't know what the root problem is. So that was in some ways the scariest part. And making sure that our investors, our board, our leadership staff, we were transparent about the level of uncertainty and the challenge, but yet we projected this air of confidence of what that we were going to make it through it. And in some ways, that was that biggest challenge, and luckily we skated through. I'm on the fake it before you make it. It's more of how much you drink your own Kool-Aid and when do you stop drinking, and that's kind of definitely on the companies that are struggling, knowing either when to pivot or when to give up and return money. I don't think there's a magic formula other than making sure you have like that. To me, that's where that partnership, like having a partner that could really wrestle with things. Our wrestling tended to be at 3 a.m. over Skype at the time, and that was like having that person who could hold up that mirror and you could see your real reflection. I think was really valuable.
I definitely can relate with this. In our startup, we have this 3 dimension that we project, and for that you need a specific calibration algorithm and also a muscle compensation algorithm that in the first 2 years and a half didn't work. And I always had to pitch that to investors and to partners, and I knew how to make it work, but I knew that 5 out of 10 times doesn't work, but you couldn't say that. On the other hand, you look at documentaries like Theranos, and you're thinking if you're an imposter or not, and if you're gonna solve that problem in the end. It's exactly like you were saying. We were open to our investors, but on the other hand, we seem to be confident that it will be solved. And internally, we didn't know how to solve it, and we were thinking, I hope we can solve it. Nowadays, sure, everything works fine and it's great, but I always remember the nights that I couldn't sleep, and I was thinking a lot if I'm an imposter or not. And that it's something that I think lots of startup founders have to address as a problem. When it's too much, and when you should pivot or say that you should stop it, or where is something that you just have to go forward and push it and it will work out good. I think this is one of the biggest challenges.
Well, I think especially in the Bay Area, there's this mythology of the startup founder where everything's going right. The brilliant people just like everything just works for them, and that doesn't happen even for the super successful ones. And just because people create their own mythos, and I think it's really important to understand that there's a lot of luck involved, and once you never mistake luck for skill. Now, there is a lot of skill in the sense of like you've got to place the right bets, and you've got to know that this bet is more likely to pay off and this one is less likely to pay off. But then it's still that roll of the dice and that luck, like we're in the right place, right time. What is helping externally? What are competitors coming in? Who's getting the major funding? And just trying to understand differentiating where you're going to be lucky and where you're going to require skill. I think that's in some ways the art. And it sounds like that's what you did with the thing. You said, I bet I can make it. on this area, and you were right.
Yeah. And also the press is usually looking only about after the success stories, and they are pushing you to make always a success story. So you get lots of publicity, but on the other hand, it has to be successful. So you have to be careful with which is the right balance of. Yeah, let's get some questions also from the audience. We have one from Eric. Consumers expect simple devices. How complex is it to keep things simple? Is simplicity even an option anymore?
So I think that the first thing is, again, James and I are both engineers by training. Engineers tend to like complexity. We like all the bells and whistles, and we know they're all possible. I think that, again, going back to that, part of the value of having a partner was complementary skill sets. And I think one of James's great skills has been kind of distilling down, being able to kind of be excited by the speeds and feeds, like that giant list of features, but knowing, kind of staying away from that. And so actually in the very first Fitbit, we had 3 screens: steps, distance, and calories. And we had one button, and we're like, we're not going to put time. Everyone has this was a clip-based thing. Everyone has a watch. Everyone has a phone. Why would we possibly put a clock there? That's yet one more button push you're going to have to do to get through the screens. Turns out that was a mistake. We thought we were adding simplicity, and it turns out our users wanted the time. And so that was immediate feedback. We're like, great, it's easy. We've got a clock. We can easily throw the time up there. I think, to me, the most magical products are actually have that complexity. Real complexity is hiding the complexity. It's as soon as the user says, I wish when I press this button, it did X, and they say, well, let me try, and they press it, and then X happens. That, I think, is great design. I think, again, one of the lucky things we had is James has, I think, a really good design sense and design aesthetic. I think the other thing we agreed on early on is, both when we worked internally with each other and had different design opinions, or when we worked with external designers, is design by consensus is generally bad design. I think we both felt that a strong design ethos, even if it was wrong, was better than a mushy design ethos, that's where you tend to have the let's put buttons everywhere. And so we always either James had a strong design opinion, or when we worked with a designer, we'd articulate our views, but then try not to design by committee. And I think trying to do that balance of giving input but not designing by committee, that's probably one of the harder things on designing something.
Okay. We have another question from the audience, and also it's interesting, and I will want to add one that is close. So it's from Ana Maria. And she's asking, how did you manage to successfully combine the technical development and the business development? And I also want to add 2 more in this area. What were the roles when you started out as a team? And I know from my experience that with me and my co-founder, there are always lots of roles that appear from out of nowhere, and we are just doing our best to take them. And I know also that what I've seen is that especially his role as a CTO, it's evolving a lot. So for him, when we started, he was this great developer that had to have lots of skills, and now he has to develop his skills as a manager to manage the technical team. I'm curious to see what happens next when you have 1,000 employees, and how your role evolved during the growth of the company.
So there's a lot to unpack there. Kind of going back to that beginning part. So I think. So I cannot imagine starting with a technical co-founder is not also technical. I think we both very much spoke the same language. I think there's definitely people who have the business CEO and the technical CTO, and they work together. I would say James is as technical, if not more technically skilled than I am, especially in certain areas, and especially in the early days. And so we were both in the trenches together, doing both kind of business development, fundraising, taxes, taking out the garbage, IT, you name it. I think, first of all, knowing that trying to balance the no job is beneath you like part of being a founder is making sure you're filling all the cracks, having the ego that you can do it, and then also recognizing when do you need to hire a professional to step into that role. I mean, that's a real challenge, especially if you're a thriftier founder. Like, there's a temptation to do everything yourself. In the early days, so I think for us, in terms of roles, there's usually CTO and CEO. CTO is either the technical co-founder or the other technical co-founder. I'm the other technical co-founder in this case. I also did the taxes, HR. Like, when we hired our first employees, I had to go figure out, in the US, we have to figure out health insurance and retirement benefits and a whole bunch of legal complexities. I just happen to like that stuff and find it kind of interesting. I was quite pleased when we hired real professionals to take it over, but I used to spend 2 days filling out our annual tax return. Whereas I think there were other things that James found really exciting and really interesting. And like, he really enjoyed some of the sourcing stuff of like, how can I go and spend all day searching on Google for the right component, for the right shape, for the right size, and who's the vendor? Now we've got a procurement team, and boy, they're really good. But James really enjoyed that procurement aspect. And so, I think it's just a case of, talking to people and just figuring out what you love and just being aware that, like, I like that breadth. And I think a lot of founders really enjoy that breadth of, like, I get to see all the aspects of the business, and like, I want to see how the whole sausage is made as opposed to just one particular piece. And I'm not sure if I answered anyone's question there, but
No, it's pretty accurate. Getting back to the team structure, some of the challenges that you have as a co-founder when you start out is at the beginning you're just you with your co-founder or with the rest of the co-founders, and then employees start to appear, and then you need a company culture. And usually when you're pretty small, that it's organically, and if you're have the right fit for leadership, it works itself. But I was thinking nowadays, as sure before 2020, I was traveling a lot to meet investors and strategic partners, and I saw how things were drifting a little bit as a culture. And I'm curious to see how you establish the culture, and then when you have a couple of hundreds of employees, how you do it. And then I'm looking at you guys, and you have a super cool culture and an office in Bucharest, and I'm thinking you guys are now in the valley, it's early morning, in here it's evening, so definitely there are so many challenges. And how do you set up the culture, and basically how do you get it right as the company is getting bigger and bigger?
um, I I don't think that James and I put a lot of thought into company culture in the early days. In fact, I think one could argue we've probably put less thought into it than we should have as we've grown to a 2,000-person org. Um, I think we do have a great company culture. I think that is due to not necessarily James and myself. It's like, it's if anything, it's the hiring decisions we made. It's the people who joined who kind of reflect our values and who share our values and how we approach problems. The trick is, you don't want to hire a bunch of yes people who are identical to you, but having people join you who, for the journey, who kind of enjoys, like, for us, it's like, enjoy the same nerdy pursuits, want to build things that are good, like have that same striving for excellence. I don't think it was something we thought about, but something we definitely lucked out, and a lot of the early employees really helped drive and then create this culture that we were then proud of, that then kind of lifted. And I think that expanded, like, our Romania office, I go there and I feel like I could have, that's just like our San Francisco office. And I feel like the people are the same, the jokes are similar. Let's do the fact that the early people we had there, Daniel is the one who's introduced me to you guys. He's the type of person that we would have hired in San Francisco because we would have enjoyed hanging out with him, and we enjoyed, like, being in the trenches, solving the problems from day one. And therefore, him, Raluca, Andre Pitas, like, there were a whole bunch of people who were there at the very beginning. Those are the people who then create the culture as the thing expands, because they're hiring people who have similar values to themselves, and creates a great company culture. I would say, in retrospect, we hired HR a little bit too late. We got to like 300 people before we hired HR. I think we didn't actually have official company values until about a year ago. And I think some of these things were probably a little bit later than we should have. We probably should have put a little more focused thought onto it. But again, the right people creates the right culture. You have the best things on the wall, but if you don't have the right people, the things on the wall become meaningless.
We have some more questions that are getting us back to the hardware part, and we can take one from Adriana. For a software product, you see bugs, you create updates. If a hardware product has flaws, you need to recall them. And if you already ship to customer, and that is all there is. Is there a way, any way, to prevent those recalls using your own software for wearables? And I just want to add that for us, yeah, we learned the hard way. I'm also curious, so I just remember two big issues. One was we have magnetic charger system, and then the pins we didn't treat them with an anti-rust and anti-sweat, and yeah, we had big problems with them. And then the second was when we got all the sensors, we didn't have the way to install the embedded software via air, just to deploy it via Bluetooth. So that was another interesting story, as we had hundreds of of boxes with sensors that needed to be installed. Anyway, so for us, those were some of the things that we've messed up, and I'm curious to see if you have any advices how you set up all these logistics with hardware, where you basically, if you have any issues, you cannot simply provide an update for it.
Well, I do think in some ways our software background really helped us in the early, like now everything is field updatable from a software perspective. That was not as common just because like, building an update protocol is really hard. And especially if you're doing something like, we were fighting over not bytes, we were fighting over bits in memory. And so, we basically said by fiat, everything has to be field updatable. And like the people working on a contractor, especially were pushing back, like that's absurd. You don't need that. That's a waste of space. And boy, were we glad we had that, because there's a lot of things you could fix in software. They send rovers to Mars, which completely break, and magic software fixes suddenly work around those and bring them back to life. So definitely making sure things are field updatable. But you also mentioned, throwing out or kind of having real problems with the first several hundred. One of the pieces of advice we got in the early days was the first 500 devices you're going to build, you're going to throw out. And we're like, do you know how little money we have? That is the stupidest thing we've ever heard. We're not dumb enough to build 500 things and throw them out. We threw out the first 500 devices we built for the exact reason. I think a lot of startups, like there's EVT, DVT, PVT, was something we'd never heard of before, like these different production runs we have to work through. I think a lot of startups feel like the first thing coming off the line, we ship it, we make money. We don't have the luxury of not doing that. You have to. The other thing is, I think, especially for consumer stuff, you as a founder have to be super users. And you've got to find other friends and family to be super users as well, who are both and you've got to be self-critical. Like, what is that thing that's going to annoy people? That you mentioned sweat. For us, it was like the charging context didn't always mate. And it was like, it's something you could definitely rattle it into place, but it was an annoyance. And we're like, we can't ship with this annoyance. We need to find a way of making sure when you slide the contact on, it's going to get a really good grip, because it's got to charge every time. It has to have that little snap feel. Otherwise, it feels cheap or feels broken. And so you've got to pay attention to those details, and you've got to care about those details. And sometimes you might get lucky and your device might not have the problem. So you need to make sure you've got enough friends and family also playing with it, or coworkers who also share that passion for details. Early employees, I feel like it's really, or kind of if you're starting a new office, like you get to have those people who are passionate about the details. Not as they detail blinders on, that's all they focus on. They also need to focus on the big picture. But if you don't care about the big detail, the small details, the big picture just evaporates.
Let's talk a little bit about competition. I was thinking about the Fitbit journey, and after you were successful, basically you had lots of very cost-effective products in the market at half of your price. And then after you managed to solve that, then Apple and Samsung started competing you. And I would say this is also a question from Alina. How important are design and offering price range as a differentiator from the competition? Let's say Apple. So it's also a question from the audience.
So I think first of all, our competitors now versus at the beginning are completely different. Like if you look through the VC decks, venture capital decks, like most of those competitors don't exist anymore. But boy, they were supposed to eat our lunch at the time. And they were big companies and they were multinational companies. So we initially, there was Omron who made, like, own the pedometer market. They were going to crush us. Then there was Body Media who, had these fancy high-tech devices that went on your upper arm. It was interesting because they were completely different parts of the market. And then, then it was Jawbone. Nike came in. Nike, when they first launched, they had a wrist-based device. They spent more in marketing in one day than we had spent in our entire company history up until that date. And ironically, we actually saw an increase in sales that date because, again, this is part of, you've got to know who you speak to and who your competitors speak to. And if they're highly funded competitors and they're speaking the exact same market and you don't have anything novel, that's a problem. What's interesting is Nike's brand and Nike's product really resonated with 24 to 30-year-old men, whereas our product skewed heavily female. And so their marketing came in with like these big sweating athletes, like showing like it's all about that tough hill you're gonna climb. And our people were like, hey, I need to get my kids to school and I would like to go on a brisk walk or go on a run. How do I balance my life? And so figuring out, like, what's interesting is though Nike drove awareness, and then our marketing kind of came in the void of like, oh, that's actually the product I'm more looking at. So I think kind of crafting your marketing and your skill set to know where you are. I think there's a real risk of being crushed in the middle. So you do have to recognize, like, there's often everyone builds a standard multi-quadrant chart, and you're always the top quadrant, and you're always going to expand. I think understanding when is it you're a unique quadrant versus the other quadrants just going to squeeze in on you, that's something you have to really kind of look at your business and understand specifically. Like, you mentioned low-cost competitors in Apple. Like, does Fitbit get squeezed in the middle, or does Fitbit have a unique value proposition of like, they were both, general fitness devices or cheap things that paired with phones, and we are kind of the health and fitness experts, and that's our brand. We're the non-judgmental brand. And so understanding brand positioning and where you are is really important. And then trying to figure out what are the choices you make from both a product and a marketing perspective that kind of reflect that then and use as a rubric is important. And then making sure you're going back in full circle and just saying, just because you have a thesis doesn't mean you get to, that's the right thesis. You have to then do constant reevaluation. I would say the hardest thing as we've grown as a company, as a startup, you tend to reevaluate in a really fast cycle. And as you become a multi-thousand person company, there's a fine line between frequent reevaluation and people going, you're wishy-washy, you've got no focus, you've got to let us execute. When you get bigger, you can't steer the ship the same way as when you're in a small speedboat, and they both have different skills. Like the big company, we've got that. Like we go into stores and we say we want to put on our shelf tomorrow. No one asks questions. When you're a startup, but that means that the product we pick a year from now, we've already picked that product that's going on the shelf. When you're a startup, you can change that many times, but you can't guarantee that spot on the shelf. And so there's different pros and cons to different stages. And everyone is jealous of the other person's stage, I
found. We have lots of other, let's say, more technical questions about Bluetooth and 5G, but I would also want to go in the area of the future of Fitbit and talk a little bit about healthcare, because I've seen that you talk a lot about healthcare and about prevention and using the huge amount of data that you guys already collected for the greater good. Can you tell us more about what you're doing next with Fitbit and how can you support the healthcare industry? And also, from our experience, there are two ways to approach it. You go B2C, and then you put pressure on the healthcare stakeholders like doctors and insurance companies. And definitely, I heard lots of stories where Fitbit users go with tons of information in a spreadsheet to their doctor, and they are saying, now do something with it because you have to know how to use it. So definitely that's something that you did. And on the other hand, we are trying to align all the stakeholders in the healthcare market, which is super complicated, as they say that they want to innovate, but everybody's afraid to not do any mistake. Therefore, it's moving very slow. And I'm curious to see what's your strategy and what will be basically the plan for going into the healthcare market?
Yeah, well, I think you have to know your strength. And our strength has always been the ability to talk directly to our consumers. And so leveraging that for our springboard into healthcare, if we were if I were starting this from scratch and trying to compete with Fitbit, I had a CEO who was head of a major health provider or part of a national health system, I might take a very different approach. I think Fitbit, early on, we've made the invisible visible. Like, part of the reason James and I fought so hard to make sure we could get this connected device is so that people could see longitudinally how I'm doing this. I think humans tend to be very good at focusing on what is right in my face, but they're not necessarily very good at knowing trends or thinking about trends or long-term impacts. And so, I think people being able to see, oh, I'm really sedentary during the week. Like, intuitively they knew that, but until it's black and white in front of you, or in this case, it was red and blue because that was the color of our graphs at the time, they were like, oh, then I see it. I think you mentioned the transition to healthcare. That has been a long and interesting journey. When we first started working on heart rate, at that point, no one else was doing heart rate on the wrist. Everyone told us it was a stupid idea. Because their theory was you either had a chest strap, which is the most accurate way of doing heart rate because you're a high-end athlete, or you were in a coma in a hospital, in which case you just put something on your fingertip and that's fine. Like, probably the worst place to get heart rate in the entire human body is right on the front of the back of the wrist. And that's where we said, that's where we're doing it. And our research team was luckily very patient with us. They said, that's a really dumb idea because that's really hard physiologically. We said, we believe in you, you could go and do it. And luckily, they were able to pull through. But again, when people start seeing this data, it starts changing behavior. And, so kind of fast forward, now everyone's doing heart rate on the wrist. And everyone thinks, of course, why wouldn't you do heart rate on the wrist? And so we start getting regular reports. And, one of the things that's great about consumer is, and it never occurred to me, like, when I have a problem, I write to customer help. I never write in nice things to customer help, which, being a customer support person is really hard. Be nice. Whenever you call for customer support, be nice to those people. They've got probably one of the hardest jobs you can imagine. But we got thank you notes, and we got people writing in to say, hey, this is great. This is great, but, I was driving along, and my Fitbit said, I've got 150 beats per minute, but I'm in a car. My Fitbit must be broken. They're driving along, like, still said it. I'm just going to go to the doctor just to be safe. They get to the doctor said, that's great. Your Fitbit matches our fingertip blood thing. Good thing you came in. You would have been dead in half an hour. And, it was great and really satisfying that we were saving people's lives, but we're doing that by accident, not directionally. And so I think we've been trying to do a much more focused effort to, like, how can we identify these things before the user notice it? How can we recognize what the trends in their data are? Because, again, people don't necessarily always see these. How can we help them find them? And how do we help them change their behavior to be healthier? And how do we also then help recognize? And again, health means something very different as you age. Like, when we started Fitbit in our 20s, health meant something different. I'm now a parent of 2 in my 40s. Health means something different now. My father, who is in his 70s and has type 2 diabetes, health means something different. And I think one of the things that I feel like very lucky about with Fitbit is we've been able to help health across all those different dynamics through a combination of data collection, through data analysis we just present, through AI on top of that analysis to try and give meaning to that data, through guidance based on like that population level analysis, and through just human-based health coaching has also then been another thing. And I think we viewed ourselves as, we're not trying to replace doctors. People try to keep talking about how technology is going to replace doctors. Doctors and medical establishment are really good at specific things. They're just overwhelmed right now. And I think our job is to figure out, how can we help them? How do we help keep an eye on people when they're not at the doctor's office, such that when they come to the doctor's office, the doctor can do what they're really good at and solve those things in the moment. So that's hopefully how Fitbit plays in the future.
Unfortunately, the time is running out, and we will have to wrap it up. I have one more question, though. We talked a lot about the part that it's hard in the hardware, and I was thinking that I also see this in an article that basically hardware it's just different. It's not harder, and you have to prepare for it and know what to expect. And I was thinking if hardware it's easier now in 2020, and what you have done differently in your journey. And this is the last question.
So again, I think hardware was hard for us because we went in with zero hardware knowledge. Like, we've both taken hey, let's put integrated circuits on a board, put wires together and create a calculator. We had done that in school, but that was as much hardware as either of us had. So I think it was just more the learning curve. It'd be like a hardware person going, I'm going to do a tax software company. that would be hard because of the steep learning curve. Definitely working and identifying manufacturers has gotten a lot easier. I think also manufacturers have gotten really good at, or gotten much better about working with startups and kind of understanding how to make that successful for both. I think hardware startups tend to require more capital, so a lot of like there kind of goes in waves where a lot of the venture community invests in hardware, they're really excited about it, then they all get burned, they stop investing in hardware, and there's definitely a cyclical loop there. We were definitely lucky; we were kind of caught the very start of the next cycle, and I think through our success, we then powered and gave investors confidence investing in other hardware startups. Um, I think that the other hard thing about hardware is you have to raise more money because it's more capital intensive, because you've got to build stuff and then manage inventory. I think the other thing about hardware is understanding what is the business model, because it's very easy. You mentioned kind of cheap things out of China. They're competing. There's there's a whole ability to commoditize hardware, and so you got to figure out what is my business model such that I stay ahead. And enterprise, it's very different than consumer. Consumer hardware, because of volume, there's a lot more commoditization than enterprise. So it's a very different world. And consumer then figuring out what is my services, a component, things like that. Razor versus razor blade. There's a lot of interesting business models there, and happy to talk about that offline if people would like.
That's great. I was really excited to meet you. I remember when we've went through How to Web. They have a test and a startup pitching contest, and also they have a accelerator called MVP Academy. And we were talking with people about building this hardware startup, and it was 4 years and a half ago. And everybody from the community looked at us like you're crazy. And the only successful startup that we knew in Romania was Vector Watch with Andrei Pitish and the rest of the team. And now, after all these years, I'm looking how the community evolved and what How to Web is doing, and that we have a live call with you talking about this. So for me, it's wow. Yeah, I'm really, really excited, and I want to thank How to Web for having this experience and helping the community like this, and also to be defender for making this happen and supporting us. And it was a great call, and I was really happy to have it and to meet you, Eric. And thank you again for your time and for your knowledge. And I hope there will be a chance that we'll see you more.
I hope to at some point be able to do this type of thing in person. So, Camil, thank you very much. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you.